assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Cuban army pilots opened the first phase of organized revolt with bombing raids on 3 military bases. 2 of the B-26 light bombers then seek asylum in Florida. On the heels of the air raids, landings were effected by rebels at several places on the Cuban coast, and the rebellion against the red-tinged dictator was on, with the refugee pilot claiming a full-scale army revolt near. In Havana, Acting Foreign Minister Olivares shows diplomats rockets fired from the Cuban raiders, which he claims have U.S. marking. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Cuban Foreign Minister Roa accused the United States of unleashing a war of invasion. Roa says the invading soldiers trained in Florida, but Ambassador Stevenson makes a quick denial.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically. The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
Good morning and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. My name is Kelly Vlahos and my producer Christopher Leonard is in the background, and we are so excited to bring Peter Kornbluh on the show today. Peter is a senior analyst at the National Security Archive and director of the Chile Documentation Project and the Cuba Documentation Project at the archive. He is the author of numerous books, including Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, The Pinochet File, a declassified dossier on atrocity and accountability, and Bay of Pigs Declassified, the secret CIA report on the invasion of Cuba. In addition to regular articles at The Nation magazine, his work has been published at The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. Peter Kornbluh, we are so excited to have you on the show today. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to be here. We have very serious and important things to talk about.
Absolutely. So as we saw in the newsreel, Bay of Pigs invasion occurred 65 years, April 17th, 1961. So 65 years ago this month. And you have written and researched quite extensively on this, but I was wondering, if you could just kind of set the table for viewers and listeners who may have heard of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba so many years ago during the John F. Kennedy administration, but might not know, how it came to be. And I have a special question to add to that is, how was President Kennedy actually convinced that it would work?
Well, I want to start with the newsreel that you just put on your screen. Literally every single statement in that newsreel was a lie, was false. The planes that are shown at the beginning of that newsreel were U.S. planes. They weren't planes from Cuba, although they were painted by the CIA to look like planes from Cuba. And when the plane was presented to reporters with the supposed defecting pilot who had dropped his bombs over Cuba, the reporters saw that the plane had just been painted and it was sticky. It had the wrong nose cone for a Cuban plane. It had the nose cone of a U.S. plane. And this was the cover story that the CIA had put together for what was the preliminary attack. In a paramilitary invasion, you need to take out your enemy's air force. And therefore, the CIA organized a bombing raid on Castro's air force, took out about half the planes, and then made up this cover story, which then Adlai Stevenson presented to the United Nations, completely lying. He himself was misled by the CIA. This was the cover story they presented to him, the claims, and he lied to the world. It was a little bit like Colin Powell and the Iraq argument for why we needed to invade Iraq. But I think that newsreel gives you a sense of how the American public was, from the first minutes, misled. The Bay of Pigs was an effort at regime change. The planning for it started about a year after the Castro Revolution. Kelly, the CIA, the State Department, Eisenhower White House decided they couldn't coexist with Fidel Castro. At the beginning, he looked like a romantic revolutionary, but now he was saying all sorts of nasty things about the United States. His anti-American rhetoric was just so powerful, and he was an extremely popular revolutionary leader, not only in Cuba, but throughout the entire Latin American region. And everybody was inside the US government, particularly the CIA, was extremely concerned about his popularity. And the issue became how to get rid of him. And in March of 1960, Eisenhower signed an authorization for covert operations to roll back the Cuban Revolution. And the CIA started down the road towards planning the Bay of Pigs. They had an assassination program that involved the U.S. mafia. They took $200,000 of the invasion budget and gave it to the mafia to assassinate Castro in advance of the invasion so that it would be more likely to succeed. All of this failed step by step. How was young President Kennedy convinced to go this route? He inherited this covert program that his predecessor, the very famous, popular war hero, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had authorized. Like Eisenhower, Kennedy insisted that this be a covert operation. Why? Because the United States, given the international order of law and treaties to the sovereignty of other nations, wasn't supposed to be flagrantly invading another country and overthrowing its government. To do so would give license to the Soviets to invade West Berlin and take that. And so Kennedy had concerns that started with Eisenhower. Eisenhower had those concerns. Kennedy had those concerns. He insisted that the hand of the United States not show. But he was also told, in his skepticism about whether this would succeed, that the population would rise up and support the invaders, that if the beachhead couldn't be secured, the invaders would fade into the mountains and start a counter-revolution, just like Castro's revolution had started in the mountains. And he wasn't told about all the setbacks, drawbacks, restrictions, constraints, and problems that obviously came to play the moment the CIA tried to implement this egregious act of aggression, and it failed. And it was 65 years yesterday that Kennedy went before the press and said, "I'm the responsible person." There's a famous saying he said that victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. I'm the responsible official in the U.S. government. Without going into detail about the CIA operations. This was a humiliating setback for his young presidency. It was a humiliating defeat and debacle for the CIA itself, which was kind of outed for the first time in its history. It was called the perfect failure because just about every aspect of the operation and the goals of the United States government completely failed. Here, the U.S. government was trying to separate Cuba from the Soviet Union, and instead, in the middle of the attack on Cuba, Fidel had announced that Cuba would be a socialist state. They needed the Soviet Union now to protect them from the aggressor of the North. The assault on Cuba and Cuba's victory led to kind of a consolidation of the revolution. And at a meeting after the invasion, Che Guevara, representing Fidel, met with Richard Goodwin, the White House aide representing Kennedy, and said, "Thank you for the invasion. You've helped us consolidate, and you've transformed us from an aggrieved little country into an equal. So we ended up strengthening the revolution rather than rolling it back.
I mean, that's incredible. Absolutely incredible. And we'll talk a little bit about the lessons learned and not learned in today's regime change endeavors that never seem to go away, even after this stunning failure of regime change. But I know that when you had written the book, in, I believe it was 1998, Bay of Pigs Declassified. It was based on a top secret 100-page CIA Inspector General survey that I think you or your colleagues had called the sort of holy grail for those who are investigating the Bay of Pigs and its aftermath and the implications on the national security state. Can you talk a little bit about that autopsy of the invasion plans that the CIA had tried to keep hidden, but the National Security Archive had finally gotten released through numerous FOI requests, FOIA requests rather. Can you talk a little bit about how important that was and what it said?
Yeah, in the book Bay of Pigs Declassified, I refer to the report as the historical holy grail of the history of the invasion. It was a comprehensive study done by the CIA's own Inspector General Lyman Kirkpatrick. It was based on dozens of interviews with the actual managers and players and operatives and officials who were involved in planning and implementing the paramilitary assault, and a review of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of top secret documents to come to the conclusions that it was the CIA itself that was responsible for the failure of the Bay of Pigs. The key conclusions were that by compartmentalizing the secrecy around the invasion, the CIA excluded experts from its analytical side that could have told it that Fidel Castro was significantly popular, that the Bay of Pigs itself was an area that he had taken the revolutionary kind of efforts to improve healthcare and literacy, build roads, bring water and electricity. He was even more popular in the area that they ended up picking for the invasion. The CIA mistreated the brigade members and political exiles that it was relying on for the false story that this was an exile-led operation, and that the CIA itself had neither the capabilities nor the actual institutional structures to conduct what was essentially a war. It was just impossible to say that it was going to be a covert operation given the magnitude of its size and breadth, and that this was beyond the capability and mission of the CIA, and that the CIA should have gone to Kennedy and told him, "This is going to fail. You should call it off," and didn't. So the report was extremely critical of the CIA, even as other CIA officials were trying to blame Kennedy for not letting a covert operation turn into an overt military full-fledged invasion of Cuba. So this report was, everything you would want in a contemporary history by the agency itself. And the agency went to great lengths to destroy almost all copies of the report and to hide it from both other U.S. officials and the U.S. Congress, who, of course, were asking many questions about what should be done to address the CIA's responsibility for this incredible foreign policy debacle that the Kennedy administration had suffered.
It doesn't seem that the CIA was tempered by its anti-Castro activities after this stunning debacle, after this postmortem, this inward-looking reflection as to what went wrong. Didn't they double down on their anti-Castro activities after that, despite all that we know about the Bay of Pigs?
Well, if you look at it, if you look at the details, I would say that's not quite accurate. For from April to August, the CI was essentially shut down on Cuba operations because Kennedy just was trying to figure out whether he was going to dismantle, reorganize, reconfigure the CIA. We've written about this in your extraordinary, website, Responsible Statecraft. And the CIA was stymied. Kennedy ended up firing the director of the CIA, Alan Dulles, and then he ended up firing Richard Bissell, the deputy director for covert operations, who was largely the architect of the Bay of Pigs operation and the person who most responsible for misleading Kennedy about the likelihood that it would succeed. So those two people were fired. The whole Cuba branch was dismantled, and it began to be reconstructed in the fall of 1960 when it was Kennedy himself who basically decided we have to go back after Castro. We can't, take this defeat sitting down, and authorized a new set of covert operations called Operation Mongoose in late 1961 in the long-term aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion. So the Kennedy administration itself, Robert, John, they didn't really like to lose. And they revived the effort and threw a lot of money at it. And the CIA, obviously, the Cuba operations became the dominant covert set of operations in Latin America. And we've learned, I have to say, I know you're interested in this, we've learned a lot more about the details of all of that from the unredacted release of John F. Kennedy papers, Assassination Act papers that involve hundreds, thousands of pages on Cuba operations. And I just happen to have an article in this month's Cigar Aficionado called JFK: The Final Secrets on Cuba. And
Excellent.
those documents are completely unredacted, and they give you the budget figures. They tell you the names of every official that was involved, and all the different operations and code names. And it's a fascinating history. And of course, all of this aggression that we're revisiting is immediately relevant to the current state of U.S. threats of renewed military aggression towards Cuba.
If you would, could you share maybe some of the revelations that were most striking to you out of the the recently released JFK files?
Well, there was this one amazing covert operation that was part of Operation Mongoose, where the CIA got intelligence that a cargo ship, which was carrying millions of pounds of raw Cuban sugar, to Odessa, from Havana to Odessa, had needed repairs and was going to port in Puerto Rico. And the CIA maintains a lot of agents among dock workers and dock officials all over the world to provide intelligence on what ships are coming in, what they're carrying, etc. And this proved to be very beneficial to an operation they decided to undertake when this cargo ship, docked in Puerto Rico for repairs. About 14,000 bags of the raw sugar was taken off the boat and put into a warehouse while the repairs were going on. And the CIA went in and used a chemical compound to contaminate about 800 bags of that sugar. And their whole scheme was the sugar would all get mixed together when it finally reached Odessa, and it would be used in coffee and cakes and pastries and all sorts of baked goods, and it would taste terrible. It would just taste awful, and all the Soviets would be upset, and they would reject anything with Cuban sugar, and this would destroy Cuban-Soviet relations because sugar was one of the main kind of bartered exports
Yeah.
from Cuba to the Soviet Union. And so it was and they did a whole report that they'd gone in and they they contaminated it and it was all worked out. But then they went and they told Kennedy that they had done this, thinking that he would pat them on the back. And his reaction was, "You have introduced chemical warfare into the food
That's
chain."
right.
What would be the response? Our response if the KGB started to poison grapes or
Yeah.
watermelons or wheat or whatever. This is opening a very difficult situation for us. Go back and make sure that sugar never gets to the Soviet Union. And the CIA spent a whole year trying to undo a successful covert operation that it just succeeded in undertaking. It filed a false legal lawsuit claiming that the sugar should be confiscated to pay for expropriated properties in Cuba. False exiles. It put sugar brokers on the payroll, and they went in and bought the shipment from the court, which had confiscated it, the whole thing. And so it took a year, and eventually they took those 800 bags of sugar out into the middle of the ocean and dumped them into the water. So, I mean, that's an entertaining covert operation that we didn't really know the details about before, but there are hundreds of murderous operations that we've learned about from the JFK papers, which because of the way the law was written to declassify them, ended up forcing almost all of them to be declassified in full with
Yeah.
no redactions, which is something that almost never happens with CIA covert operations history.
Well, I had interviewed Jefferson Morley on the show like last year when the documents were starting to flow. And he's been covering that whole period, the summer before the assassination in Miami, and all the activities, the covert activities that were going on then with the CIA, the FBI. And it's just amazing how much the government had infiltrated a lot of the anti-Castro, pro-Castro groups, and had been, just sort of doing a lot of funny business and trying to manage messaging, had installed journalists at major newspapers. And I mean, it's very interesting from a journalistic perspective, like from my perspective historically. But one of the questions that I have, and I continue to have, is that JFK was in this position after the Bay of Pigs to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces, as he was quoted in a fit of anger afterwards as saying, but as you recalled for us, that he didn't do that. And I was just wondering what your theory was as to why he didn't go the entire way and reorganize that agency so that it could not do some of the dastardly things that it had been doing at the time.
The issue for John F. Kennedy was the control of the CIA, and whether the CIA was a rogue operator in the sense that it was conducting its own foreign policy, its own operations with really very little supervision of the White House and very in minimal communication with the State Department. And we actually put the two main memos that deal with his consideration of reconfiguring the CIA on our website as part of a 65th anniversary posting on the Bay of Pigs, and I wrote about those two memos for you and Responsible Statecraft a year ago, and they're rather potent. People, I don't think, are really familiar with this whole kind of small window in which Kennedy and some top White House aides were talking about how to deal with the CIA and how to reconfigure it. And he sent his aide, Arthur Schlesinger, off to England to look at the model of British intelligence and how MI6 was basically subordinate to the foreign policy dictates of the British Foreign Ministry, rather than being a competitor in foreign policy and implementing U.S. goals with the Foreign Ministry. And that was the report that Schlesinger came back with. If we want to adopt that model, we have to shift around some of the CIA's responsibilities, and Schlesinger came up with new names for the newly restructured intelligence side of the CIA and operations side of the CIA, but very quickly after the Bay of Pigs, all sorts of other world issues came up. Vietnam, the crises in Berlin, and eventually, very soon, the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there's a direct line from the history of the Bay of Pigs to the Cuban Missile Crisis that people don't quite understand. Cubans, understood that the U.S. might return with bald aggression the next time, that they weren't going to fail the second time around. And the Cubans signed a defense pact with the Soviet Union. As part of that under that defense pact, Khrushchev suggested that they put nuclear missiles secretly into Cuba to deter a future attack, future aggression, and they did. And we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which led to the closest the world has come to, atomic Armageddon. U.S. aggression, as we're finding out right now in Iran, does become a global issue and does become a danger to the global community, the world community, not just the country that is under attack by the United States. And the lessons of U.S. aggression at the Bay of Pigs are still resonate today, and have to be remembered, which is why I'm so happy that we're talking about this now.
Yeah, and before we go on, because I do want to talk about lessons for today, is that I have to ask you, I mean, with all of the revelations about the CIA and what it knew about Lee Harvey Oswald and potentially being a CIA asset, do you think that the CIA was somehow involved in his assassination, or at the very least is lying about what it knew about the assassination, or at least his assassin?
I have to say, I addressed this issue in the article in Cigar Aficionado. The CIA was not involved. Oswald was not a CIA asset, and the secrecy around the CIA and Oswald had to do with protecting Operation Leon Voy, which was a major espionage surveillance operation that the CIA was running in Mexico City, and to make sure that nobody learned about that after the Kennedy assassination. The CIA went out of its way to hide where it had gotten the photographs and intercepted the intelligence about Oswald being in Mexico, and that was used by conspiracy theorists to kind of say that the CIA was protecting Oswald and a relationship with Oswald, rather than what it was really protecting, which was the overall operation it was running through the president of Mexico, with the cooperation of the president of Mexico at that time.
Do you have, and again, because I got you on the line here, I really want to ask this question because it's something that sort of has bugged me, or at least my thinking has evolved over the years. Do you think that President Kennedy comes off as a more sympathetic character in this chapter in U.S. history because of what you've learned over the years with declassified documents, such as the ones with the Bay of Pigs, essentially the ones that are coming out now, or maybe at the very least a more complicated figure in terms of the role that he was playing during this very fraught era?
In the first few months of his presidency, Kennedy yielded to the decisions that had been made by his famous predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, and let the Bay of Pigs operation go forward. Then when it failed, in the aftermath, he authorized a whole new massive set of covert operations, propaganda operations, coordinated efforts to destabilize the Cuban government and overthrow it, called Operation Mongoose. I mean, that is pure and bald intervention using the CIA. When that led to the missile crisis, it was at that point that Kennedy started to rethink this approach to the world, the dangers of bald intervention, and actually started a series of feelers to Castro about peaceful coexistence between the two countries. I mean, the whole world was chastened by the missile crisis, and Kennedy in particular was, and he worked very hard to get us out of it without actually attacking Cuba militarily or getting involved in a nuclear conflagration with Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. So that was one of the lessons that he learned that I do think is still relevant to today as we watch the current administration threaten another military assault on Cuba that won't be constrained. It won't be led by the CIA. It won't be an effort to have plausible denial that the U.S. was involved. It'll be the opposite. It'll be an open display of omnipotent U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere to show that the United States is the master of the region and that Trump is the emperor and Latin America is his empire.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, do you feel, or how frustrated do you feel when you hear observers of what happened in Venezuela, the operations there, the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the installment of Delcy Rodriguez as the new president of Venezuela, as somehow a successful regime change, that this can be done. Somehow Trump found the secret sauce of how to exact a regime change operation from the outside, the opposite of what we saw in the Bay of Pigs.
You know, the world has completely changed since the Bay of Pigs. There is no kind of lip service to international law and international order that requires the use of the CIA and plausible denial. Now it's all in the open, and that's what Trump stated. That was his display of power, starting with Venezuela and now going on to Iran, and then now threatening on Cuba, and who knows what country will be next? Canada, Greenland, Panama Canal. You know, who knows? So the world has changed completely. So the idea that Cuba is going to be victorious again if the United States launches a full-scale military assault on Cuba, or even a surgical drone strike, is a false premise. That's not the lessons of the Bay of Pigs. It's the dangers that of the Pandora's box of aggression that are the lessons. So, you know, Trump proved that the United States has very sophisticated military capabilities and that he is willing to use them, whether it's the Delta Force, whether it's drone strikes, whether it's the assassination attack that took out the entire Iranian leadership on the very first day. I mean, those are all models that the Cuban government and leaders are looking at very closely now. But there is a part of the Bay of Pigs, you know, which was these secret talks between Goodwin and Che Guevara afterwards, which show that even with aggressive intent and an example of aggression, that Cuba and the United States still have the potential to engage in a dialogue and to coexist. Cuba and the United States have been called the closest of enemies, but you know, they actually could be friends if the United States didn't have a historical posture going all the way back to the 1800s, the early 1800s, the Monroe Doctrine and the idea that Cuba should be another state of the United States in the 1800s, the Platt Amendment, the United States occupation of Cuba at the turn of the 20th century. All of these kind of imperial efforts of the past history are still relevant to Cuba today, and Trump is trying to resurrect that history, reenact that history right now in a very flagrant way. But eventually, not right away, but eventually, you know, those types of U.S. policies come back to haunt our best interests and the interests of the U.S. people, the American public, and the Cuban public.
Wouldn't it be ironic if Trump went in the other direction and decided that talking was the better pathway, and they actually came to some agreement, which I believe is on the table in terms of the Cuban government, opening up the country to business and, and in exchange for humanitarian assistance. I mean, wouldn't it be ironic after all these decades that it would be Donald Trump that would bring the two countries together through diplomacy and not military force?
Well, if he brings them together through diplomacy, it will be what political scientists have called submission diplomacy. That is, putting a gun to the head of Cuban leaders, squeezing Cuba economically, engaging in economic warfare, literally cutting off their oil and shutting down their lights, shutting down the entire economy as a way of doing that. That's
Yeah.
not what we think of when we think of diplomacy. That's not what you think of when you name your website responsible statecraft. It's not just irresponsible statecraft, it's criminal statecraft that Trump is engaged in right now. Could that happen? It's unlikely it's going to happen that way. Trump is demanding some symbol of regime change. He needs a scalp
Yeah.
to parade before his minions, and that means, the president of Cuba, the Secretary General of the Communist Party, has to step aside. Somebody else has to come in. And I just would, leave you with reminding you of what Che Guevara said to Richard Goodwin after the Bay of Pigs. We are willing to address your concerns. We want a modus operandi with the United States. We want a modus vivendi with the United States, coexistence. And we're willing to address the issues you have, expropriated property, our foreign policies, with leftist movements, some of our relations with the Soviet Union. But the one thing we won't put on the negotiating table is our system of governance. And that's basically Cuba's position 65 years later. They are willing to address U.S. concerns and U.S. demands, except for who is going to be their leadership and what their system of government is, which they basically say, we had a revolution, we have international sovereignty, we have independence from that, and we're going to continue to fight for that. And that is where the two countries are right now. I believe there is space, particularly on the economic front, for Cuba to make a virtue out of necessity. They absolutely need to open up their economy to the international world of trade and investment. But when it comes to U.S. demands that the U.S. control who the leaders of Cuba are going to be in the future, that is a far more difficult proposition. And that's where the two countries are right now in terms of this kind of open back-channel diplomacy that's being practiced as Trump continually threatens a military strike on Cuba.
And do you feel that Cuba is strong enough to resist Trump's demands for a regime change?
No country is strong enough to resist these demands. That's part of the crisis that the world is facing. The NATO countries are kind of completely in an uproar about the Trump's reconfiguration of the world order. Canada has, tried to figure out how it can respond. Smaller countries are really in a very difficult situation, and in the end, that's what Cuba is. It is a large Caribbean island, but it is a small country compared to the Colossus of the North. Can it resist? Yeah, sure, it can resist over the course of 50, 60 years and build another revolution down the road. But does it have defenses to stop a U.S. drone strike or special operations teams going into Cuba? It doesn't. But what we need to do is push for responsible statecraft and see if there is a way in which there is some kind of off ramp that doesn't lead to the destruction of Cuban society, Cuba's buildings, Cuba's cities. It doesn't lead to a mass migration crisis, which certainly could come if the United States starts to attack Cuba. And that ends up peacefully in the best interest of everybody concerned in the region and the world.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I would just like to remind our audience to check out Peter's book from 1998, Bay of Pigs Declassified, the Secret CIA Report on the Invasion of Cuba, as we, recognize the 65th anniversary of the failed invasion and hoping upon hope that our leaders will heed some of those lessons from 1998. 1961. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining me, and I hope you'll come on again and keep writing for Responsible Statecraft.
I will do both of those things. The Cuba story is not over by a long shot, and we're going to have to be working very hard to push for responsible statecraft when it comes to Cuba.
Thank you.